one final warning. 1984 is, I believe, a quite terrifying masterpiece. So terrifying, in fact, I don't think I should like to read another like it.
I am not absolutely dissatisfied with it. I think it's a good idea, but the execution would have been better if I had not been under the influence of TB when I wrote it.
You once claimed that you have an ability to face unpleasant facts. Is that what you demonstrated in 1984 by drawing an accurate but portrait of the future?
I think that allowing for the book being, after all, a parody, something like 1984 could actually happen. This is the direction the world is going in at the present time. In our world, there will be no emotions except fear, rage, triumph and self-abasement. Instinct will be eradicated. We shall abolish the orgasm. There will be no loyalty except loyalty to the party. But always there will be the intoxication of power. Always, at every moment, there will be the thrill of victory, the sensation of trampling on an enemy who is helpless. If you want a picture of the future, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever. The moral to be drawn from this dangerous night situation is a simple one.
A shock report came out from the Center of Disease Control, the CDC, and it said that only 9,210 Americans died from COVID-19 alone. The rest had other different serious illnesses. This was reported by the Center of Disease Control, and to now stop the charade. It's time to stop the charade. The issue is, people are on food lines all across the whole country now. All of this was brought on by the media hoax, coronavirus. The coronavirus, although it is real, and we've seen it, and we understand it's real, it is not the epidemic or the pandemic that the WHO and the CDC said it was. And it's time to tell the truth. It's time to stop the mask mandates across the country, and it's time for people to try to go back to some semblance of life. It's time to stop worrying what the left thinks or what they write in their posts on the internet. It's time to stop worrying what the left thinks or what they write in their posts on the internet. Everyone that pays the news has now seen that this has been a hoax and a lie. Now, it's either one of two things. They didn't want you in power, or number two, they are preparing all of us for a one world currency after they've completely broken us financially. It's time to end the shit. Wouldn't you agree?
Coronavirus emergency as the number of cases passes 90,000 worldwide and the death toll climbs past 3,000. The Trump administration announcing new travel screening procedures for people flying into the U.S. from those affected areas. Here in America, there are now at least 105 cases across 13 states. 4 more people have died, bringing the total to 6, all of them in Washington state. Kaylee Hartung is there and starting us off this morning with the very latest. Good morning, Kaylee.
Good morning, Amy. Just moments, masked and gowned emergency personnel brought a person out of this nursing home and put him or her into this ambulance. This is the nursing home just outside Seattle that has been at the center of this outbreak. The Centers for Disease Control says we are facing a national health emergency. And here in Washington state, this virus is attacking the most vulnerable among us. This morning, growing fears about the coronavirus as the death toll in Washington state rises to 6. 4 of the victims from this nursing facility outside of Seattle at the center of the outbreak.
The risk for all of us of becoming infected will be increasing.
Staff and residents are now being tested. For a second night in a row here at Life Care, we've seen emergency vehicles speed in, and now another person taken to the hospital. Families with loved ones here, seriously concerned. Colleen Mallory's mother suffers from dementia.
I'm concerned about all of it. You know, if she gets sick, she's gonna be gone.
In San Antonio, local officials clashing with the CDC, declaring a public health emergency, hoping to stop the release of more than 100 people under quarantine at Laughlin Air Base, including Tyler and Rachel Torres, who've been quarantined since their honeymoon on a Diamond Princess cruise ship.
We don't know what happened to us. It's been a little bit of a roller coaster for us.
Their future now uncertain after a woman infected with COVID-19 was released from quarantine Saturday, while a CDC test was still pending. It turned out positive.
I find it totally unacceptable that CDC would release a patient prior to receiving all test results and potentially expose the public to this harm.
During the woman's 12-hour release, officials say she went to a local mall, the food court, and a hotel. There's concern across the country as the coronavirus spreads in communities from coast to coast. New York City, disinfecting schools, buses, and subways after its first confirmed case was announced. A healthcare worker who recently returned from Iran, now self-quarantining at her home with her husband.
We said early on, it wasn't a question of if, but when. This is New York. We're a gateway to the world.
Fears of the spread of COVID-19 affecting major American Twitter.
Hi, I'm Dr. Nancy Messonnier from CDC. I'd like to give you the latest update on the novel coronavirus spreading in the U.S., known as COVID-19. As of Sunday evening, March 8th, 34 states, plus New York City and D.C., reported more than 500 cases. While right now our most affected states are California and Washington, the number of affected states, cases, and deaths will continue to rise. That's why I'd like to talk to you about risk. Risk can be looked at in 2 ways. There's risk of being exposed and getting sick from this virus, and there's risk of getting very sick or dying from illness with this virus. This virus is capable of spreading easily and sustainably from person to person. And there's essentially no immunity against this virus in the population because it's new. Based on this, it's fair to say that as the trajectory of the outbreak continues, many people in the United States will at some point in time, either this year or next, be exposed to this virus, and there's a good chance they will become sick. But again, we do not expect most people to develop serious illness. This seems to be a disease that affects adults, and most seriously, older adults. Starting at 60, there is an increased risk of death, and the risk increases with age. The highest risk of serious illness and death is in people older than 80. People with serious underlying health conditions also are more likely to develop serious outcomes, including death. I'd like to go through our recommendations for people at highest risk. Make sure you have supplies on hand, like routine medications for blood pressure and diabetes. Have enough household items and groceries so that you will be prepared to stay at home for a period. Avoid crowds, especially in poorly ventilated spaces. Travelers, particularly those with underlying health issues, should defer all cruise ship travel worldwide. We also recommend that people at higher risk avoid non-essential long plane trips. Last and most important, know what's going on in your community. I understand these recommendations may not be popular and that they may be difficult for some people. At CDC, our #1 priority is the health and safety of the American people. These are the kind of recommendations I've made to my parents. Everyone has a role to play in helping to protect our family members, friends, colleagues, and neighbors who are most at risk. Check CDC's website for the latest information, cdc.gov/COVID-19, and know what's going on in your community. Let's work together to protect each other.
New tonight, data from the CDC shows just 6% of COVID-19 related fatalities in the U.S. listed the virus as the sole cause of death.
So that means 94% of people who have died with COVID had other contributing factors. But medical experts say this does not mean the virus is said the data just shows what they've been saying all along.
By the way, when anyone passes away, it's rare that there's just one reason why they passed away. Most people have what's called a cause of death and then contributing cause of death. So when I looked at the CDC information, I was like, oh, this is what we already knew, which was, yes, the majority of people who die when they have COVID had pre-existing conditions. We know in Rhode Island, as we looked at our data, about 90% have died because of COVID, and that's the main reason he passed away. Now, there were some who that wasn't the case. But I think all that's referring to is what we've already told everybody from the beginning is there's high-risk populations that are more likely to pass away from COVID.
Now, McDonald reiterated those populations are people who are older than 65 or have pre-existing conditions like hypertension, diabetes, or obesity. He said to put COVID-19 in context, for every one death that we saw from the flu last year, there have been more than 50 connected to the coronavirus this year.
Tonight, there's new concern among experts, including Dr. Anthony Fauci, that testing for the coronavirus may fall off after the CDC suddenly changed its guidelines. Now, this comes as cases are rising among children and college students. Total cases in the U.S. now top 5.8 million. The virus has killed more than 179.
The new CDC guidance suggests some who have had exposure to the virus but have no symptoms do not necessarily need a test, a stark departure from its previous stance that testing is recommended for all close contacts. That's alarmed some scientists.
Were you taken aback by that change?
Yeah, I'm certainly surprised to read it. There's no explanation of it. I am concerned, and I'd like to know why the change was made.
A Health and Human Services official today denied pressure from the White House forced the change, but CBS News has learned the White House Coronavirus Task Force was behind it. Late today, California's Governor Gavin Newsom said the state will simply ignore it.
I don't agree with the new CDC guidance, period, full stop.
More than 26,000 cases have been confirmed at colleges and some cases have been confirmed at colleges and universities nationwide. And as some K-12 schools reopen, the American Academy of Pediatrics reported a rise in childhood cases of 21% in a recent 2-week period. Nationwide cases, hospitalizations, and deaths are down, but there's a long way to go.
We're still generating 40,000 new cases per day. Hundreds of people are still dying every day. That's a very high level. It's much worse than when we opened up at the end of May.
Still, some restaurants here in Miami-Dade County may soon be able to bring their dining back indoors with some restrictions. The mayor said it could happen as early as Monday. Nora?
Manny Bojorquez, thank you.
It is the latest fad taking over the interwebs. By fad, I mean an incredibly gross mischaracterization of the truth. Maybe you saw it. Hopefully you didn't share it. It's the claim that the Centers for Disease Control is admitting it's overblown, this whole COVID-19 thing. Our Chris Vanderveen is ready to inoculate us with some truth.
Maybe you saw it too. CDC lying. Only 6% of reported COVID deaths are real. Can we go back to normal now?
And I've seen this again and again. It's Monday. It's another conspiracy of the week, right?
Dr. Leon Kelly is, as his name implies, a doctor. That means he knows more about death certificates than, well, let's say, that random dude with more numbers in his name than letters.
You have some expertise in this area, do you not? I'm a board-certified forensic pathologist, and I've signed out or overseen the signing of literally tens of thousands of death certificates in my career.
He says if you shared this nonsense, you're telling the world, hey, look at me, I'm dumb.
It's either a direct misrepresentation of how you do a death certificate, or they just don't know what they're talking about.
Here's why. Yes, the CDC did report for 6% of the deaths, COVID-19 was the only cause listed on the... That doesn't mean COVID had nothing to do with the other 94% of reported deaths.
Fortunately, most people don't have to read death certificates all day. They certainly will never read their own. And so they don't have to worry about how you feel about or what they look like.
But he does. See there, death certificates have multiple lines for the cause of death. People who get COVID, for example, often develop pneumonia, which then leads to respiratory failure, which then leads to the need for a death certificate. That COVID had nothing to do with the death? Of course not. What about diabetics or people with heart disease or asthma? What happens when they get COVID-19?
The likelihood of you dying or having severe consequences increases when you have other diseases in other organs.
So does COVID have nothing to do with those deaths? 6%ers apparently think so, and Dr. Kelly says it's time to start ignoring those people along with everyone else peddling COVID garbage on the internet.
When we look back on this and we do our lessons learned, I think as a country, one of the things we can take away from this is science literacy.
Good thought. Thanks, Doc. For next, this is, well, me, the journalist. Bye.
Half the population has some sort of chronic disease, putting them at increased risk for serious COVID complications. It's more than 100 million of our fellow Americans. You might have seen on social media, the CDC has not revised its death count for COVID-19 down. Over the weekend, social media started picking up on a much smaller CDC death count. Some political pundits and cable news personalities used it as proof of their belief that deaths from COVID-19 are much lower than reported. And some insinuated a conspiracy to scare you and tank the economy on purpose. So I called the CDC to ask which number is true. Turns out they both are. But it is false to say the CDC has cut its death toll. The CDC tells me it has been tracking 2 death counts for weeks. One is a total, updated daily based on data from local health departments. Yesterday, that number was 67,456. But the other number is a provisional total tracked by death certificates, updated each Friday. It is 38,576. When I asked the CDC why there was such a disparity, a spokesperson explained it to me like this, quoting, "It can take several weeks for death certificates to be submitted, processed, coded, and tabulated, so these data lag and may not include all deaths that occurred during a given time period. So which number should you believe?" Using Internet Archives, I went back and tracked the changes to both the total count and the provisional count back to April 10th. The CDC says the data lag by 1 to 2 weeks, so let's look at May 1st and April 17th. May 1st's provisional count is 37,308. The total count from 2 weeks earlier was 33,049. The numbers, as of now, are tracking together. You can read more about the difference with this story on WCPO.com. Busting social media myths. I'm Evan Millward, WCPO 9 News.
Before their positive test, and that means they were likely contagious around their fellow students. There are outbreaks happening in many areas across the country, but in some locations, people are behaving in a way where they're almost ignoring the pandemic entirely. This morning, startling new images out of Alabama. The pandemic not keeping crowds of hundreds from sections packed together. One principal says they're discussing changes for future games.
If there's an outbreak, there won't be high school football. I'm worried about my boys and my cheerleaders, my bands having a full season. Let us play! Let us play!
In Illinois, parents of Big Ten athletes protesting outside conference headquarters, voicing anger with the decision to postpone fall sports. At the University of Virginia, Coach Bronco Mendenhall says he's worried about all students returning to campus.
We've been staying in the same dorm as a football team. The students are coming, and some of our classes will be in person. And so, by that very design, the bubble is broken.
And as the fall semester resumes, the head of the CDC says it will take cooperation from entire communities to keep kids safe at school. President Trump's for reopening everywhere.
We have to open our schools. Hopefully we're going to be playing football. Now they're talking about the football stuff in colleges, etc.
Mississippi is facing some of the potential consequences of in-person learning. More than 200 students have tested positive and thousands more are in quarantine. One elementary school closed a week into classes because of an outbreak.
Many of the cases that we're seeing are in parties outside of the school setting, are in sleepovers outside of the school setting.
The same could be said for crowded colleges. These Thursday night parties at Ohio State University drawing concern when done. School officials say they've opened dozens of conduct cases, telling ABC students who host or attend a party or any gathering with more than 10 people will face an interim suspension. And at Notre Dame, with the university logging 336 cases, the student newspaper publishing an op-ed headlined, "Don't Make Us Write Obituaries." And at the University of North Carolina's Chapel Hill campus, classes are canceled Monday and Tuesday so that students can move home just 2 weeks after the first day of classes. They had multiple outbreaks at the university. They've now switched entirely to virtual learning. Eva?
All right. Curiosity probably caused you to click the phrase only 6% trending on Twitter. Curiosity probably caused you to click on it, and then you asked yourself, have only 10,000 Americans really died of COVID-19? Really only more than 153,000 listed on the CDC website? Well, that's the new theory triggered by data coming from, well, also the CDC. See, the data published on comorbidities or other factors that contribute to a death that shows COVID-19 is listed as the only cause of death for just 6% of all supposed COVID deaths, leading some to believe that means 94% of reported COVID deaths are not really caused by COVID at all, but other health conditions. Tweets like this saying only 6% of deaths reported have actually died from COVID fueled social media fire. President Trump retweeting this one specifically, and, well, the Q should have tipped you off in the name. Twitter later removed that tweet. Data can be molded to fit many narratives. We all know that. The narrative some are pushing with this statistic is that COVID is overblown. What does the data really mean? So what does the data really mean? What is in the context of it? Well, Dr. Pate, who is on the state's COVID-19 task force, explains it to Joe Paris.
Hashtag 6% created a firestorm on social media over the weekend. It's in reference to this CDC dataset on COVID deaths. It details the types of health conditions and contributing causes mentioned in death certificates involved with COVID deaths. The CDC website explains that, quote, for 6% of the deaths, COVID-19 was the only cause mentioned. Thousands on social media then claimed that meant 94% of COVID deaths weren't really because of the virus, but instead from other causes.
First of all, it is incorrect.
Dr. David Pate, retired CEO of St. Luke's Health and a member of the state's coronavirus task force, explains other factors listed on a death certificate along with COVID doesn't mean it's not a COVID death.
You died of pneumonia, or you died of respiratory failure, or you died of adult respiratory distress syndrome,
or you died of a heart attack, or you died of kidney failure. All of those things were caused by COVID, and the death certificate should say that.
So, what exactly does this data reflect?
What the CDC is reporting is all of those conditions that are reported on that death certificate.
Dr. Pate says this is not new or shocking data. It plays into what experts have said since the beginning.
We know the people most likely to die of COVID have underlying medical conditions.
In many cases, Pate says those with underlying health issues would have continued their normal life for years if not for COVID infection.
Just because you or I have high blood pressure, well, we can take care of that and you can live for a long time, but it is a risk factor for if we catch COVID for having a more severe illness. So it would still be the COVID that killed us, even though we might have high blood pressure or diabetes or be obese or any number of other factors.
A narrative being pushed by some is those with comorbidities along with COVID would have died anyways. To be blunt, Pate says millions of Americans have underlying factors like high blood pressure, diabetes, and obesity.
It is very callous to dismiss the deaths as, well, that was somebody who was old, or that is somebody who had an underlying medical condition. That describes a lot of our population.
Because of the narrative behind the CDC data, Pate says to him a concerning piece of data isn't being talked about. Deaths had no underlying deaths. 6% of COVID had no underlying health issues. Those are people that were expected to have an easier time with the virus. Again, from the beginning, medical experts warned of a higher death toll for those with certain factors. From a public health standpoint, social media in 2020 has complicated things like fighting a pandemic compared to decades ago.
All the conspiracy theories that before had to spread by word of mouth, but now can spread over the internet in minutes.
I want to go back to that point, Joe, you talked about. If it was only 6% that died of COVID, it's still like 10,000 people across the country so far that have died strictly from just COVID. CDC, the same group, says that 12,000 Americans died of H1N1 back in 2009, so only 6% that died of COVID. It's still like 10,000 people across the country so far that have died strictly from just COVID. CDC, the same group, says that 12,000 Americans died of H1N1 back in 2009, so it's a pretty big number either way you look at it, but that's not how you should look at it. Right, and that's still 10,000 people, Brian, that medical experts were saying, you're not a huge risk if you don't have these underlying health factors, but as we learn more about the virus, 10,000 people there didn't have any underlying medical issues according to their death certificates, according to the doctor attending to their medical bed. And so that's to Dr. Pate, at least telling me this afternoon, it's concerning because you have completely healthy people, 10,000 of them, that are still dying of COVID, and of course, Brian, thousands and thousands more that are getting sick and having to deal with millions of dollars of hospital debt. Yeah, and a lot of people over the weekend talk about HIV. You don't die from HIV, but you die because of having HIV and something else will get you there. I see how that works. All right, thank you very much, Joe. Yeah, I should say. Health officials say the first U.S. COVID-19 deaths occurred weeks earlier than previously thought. Up until now, the first U.S. coronavirus death was thought to have occurred at the end of February in Kirkland, Washington. But the CDC confirmed on Tuesday that tissue samples show a person in California died of COVID-19 on February 6th, and another Californian died of the virus February 17th. Santa Clara County said it didn't have this information earlier because both victims died in their homes at a time when testing was a lot more limited. The CDC was only testing people who were known to have traveled to an affected area and who went to a doctor for treatment of specific symptoms. Earlier this month, the county's chief executive, Dr. Jeff Smith, said data suggests California likely had cases as early as December. They weren't recognized as coronavirus because the state was having a severe flu season. For Newsy, I'm Josh Crane. Study by European scientists is raising questions about the origins of the deadly coronavirus. The study was led from the University of Cambridge in the United Kingdom. The research suggests that the first outbreak of the virus may have gone undetected and happened as early as September 2019. That's 4 months before the first cases of a new mystery illness were reported to the World Health Organization at the end of December. Researchers also think the spread started south of the central Chinese city of Wuhan, which is where doctors first noticed the outbreak that has grown a pandemic. In an exclusive interview with the South China Morning Post, Peter Forster, a geneticist at Cambridge University, explained,
The virus may have mutated into its final human efficient form months ago, but stayed inside a bat or other animal, or even human for several months without infecting other individuals. Then it started infecting and spreading among humans between September 13 and December 7.
So what's the science behind this hypothesis? The research team analyzed 1,001 strains of the SARS-CoV-2 coronavirus, which causes COVID-19. The samples were collected from around the world. Using an algorithm called a phylogenetic network that can map the global movement of organisms through the mutation of their genes, the scientists were able to reconstruct what they theorize is the first significant spread of the virus. The data indicates that it may have happened 4 months earlier than the first recorded case of infection. But the team has not been able to pinpoint the first infected person, or patient 0. Scientists say finding that person could be crucial in understanding and ultimately controlling the pandemic. In an interview with the Post in February, Dr. Sarah Borwine, an infectious disease expert at Hong Kong's Central Health Medical Practice, said,
Figuring out who patient 0 was wouldn't give us all the answers, but it would help to map the path the virus has taken and how it's travelling. It's hard to draw that map without knowing where it starts.
Identifying patient 0 would allow doctors and health officials to trace that person's movements, find out who he or she infected, and in turn the people they infected, and so on. Every country or region that has been hit by the COVID-19 pandemic has its own patient 0, the first person to bring the coronavirus into the country. And some of them have been successfully identified.
patient zeros in Thailand, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Macau, Singapore, Vietnam, the Philippines, and the United States had all been in Wuhan just before they became ill. In many instances, to isolate those who had these patients and those who had immediate contact with them, and by doing that, they limited human-to-human transmission. But as more people were infected with the coronavirus and traveled internationally, the situation quickly went out of control, because the sources of new infections were no longer linked to those patient zeros. Professor John Nichols, a pathologist at Hong Kong University, told the Post,
"There are so many outbreaks and hotspots around the world, and this virus appears to spread more rapidly than SARS, so it's going to be a big challenge to accurately pinpoint patient zero. Epidemiological research at mitigating the spread, rather than looking back."
Professor Nichols was part of the expert team that pinpointed the origins of the SARS pandemic in 2002 and 2003. In that instance, patient zero was a 64-year-old medical professor from the Chinese city of Guangzhou, who had infected at least 13 tourists staying at this hotel in Hong Kong. But far fewer people were infected by SARS than have been by COVID-19. And a search for the very first person in the world to be infected with the coronavirus that has caused this pandemic may be like looking for a genetic needle in a haystack of infections. So what did the Cambridge-led research team learn about the origins of this virus? They say their research shows that SARS-CoV-2 originated from bats. Genetic analysis found this is a 96% identical match to a coronavirus isolated by Chinese scientists from bat droppings in the southwestern province of Yunnan in 2013. But the remaining 4% of genes that differ are the results of hundreds of mutations, and it's unknown over what period of time those mutations took place. But because of the level of mutation, some scientists suspect the virus may have been spreading quietly in host animals before it evolved what it is today. But how reliable is the algorithm used by the Cambridge-led research to arrive at their theory about when the first COVID-19 outbreak started? Other scientists say the phylogenetic network has its limits. They say the accuracy of the time estimate is based on sample size and assumptions about how quickly the virus mutated. In a global pandemic like this, the virus could be mutating in unpredictable patterns. Su Bing, a genetic researcher with the Kunming Institute of Zoology, told the Post,
"So we cannot be very precise. There's always a margin for error. This work may provide some important clues to future investigations, but the conclusions should be treated with caution."
The origins of the virus have also become a politically sensitive issue. US President Donald Trump has called it a Chinese virus, and 2 American news networks quoted unnamed sources in the American government saying the virus could have come from a virology institute in Wuhan. Meanwhile, Beijing has suggested a conspiracy theory saying the virus was made and introduced to China by US soldiers taking part in a sporting event in Wuhan. But the world's top life scientists have long dismissed these theories. They say all existing scientific evidence points to a natural origin. But where?
If I'm pressed for an answer, I would say the original spread started more likely in southern China than in Wuhan. Proof can only come from analyzing more bats, possibly other potential host animals, and preserved tissue samples in Chinese hospitals stored between September and December.
Ultimately, only more research can help scientists come closer to understanding what happened and pinpointing the mysterious origins of SARS-CoV-2.
I'm doing it. So, Zero Hedge covered this, Gateway Pundit covered it, now the Washington Post covered it. So this is now mainstream media, that the president tweeted it, Twitter took it down, and the media is saying that it was misleading. That there's something about this that's nefarious, about this post, right? So we're going to look at the data straight from the CDC and see, all right, what's all the hullabaloo about? Why is Twitter losing their mind? The other thing that I just find fascinating is that, again, we've talked about how the median age of Twitter is 29 to 30, meaning half the company is between 21 and 29 years old. The company's between 21 and 29 years old, and they're making these decisions and saying, no, we know more, we know better, and saying that the president, and we're going to edit him. We're going to edit what he says. I find this stunning, because I guarantee you there aren't 12 70-somethings with a bunch of life experience saying, you know what, this is really dangerous to society, and we got to take this down. That's not what's happening here. There's a bunch of self-righteous 20-somethings who are making these decisions. And so for those of you who are not familiar, I was one of the pioneers of the software that created this. When I saw this map, and you said to me, this is not just some straight-up virus. I thought we were looking at a bat soup problem, right? I was talking about the wet markets, right? And I was lamenting the fact that I didn't take you to the wet market to buy fish and cook for you, because I shop at the wet market all the time. And then you said to me, no, this is not that. This is something nefarious is going on here. When I took one look at this thing, I said, well, wait a second, this is my software. So for those of you who don't know, the software is built with a tool from a company called ESRI in Redlands, California. I set this thing up with Oracle so that the data and the maps work together. So this is my baby. This is like my first car.
So a database, an Oracle database, drives the visuals that people see on the map. The map basically has got like buckets the data goes into, and that data drives what's on the map, right?
And that bucket is the first thing I noticed was everything was red, and that it was built to panic the public. The second thing I noticed was where it came from, which is the university. Let me repeat that. This comes from the Mike Bloomberg School of Health at Johns Hopkins University. if I remember correctly, Mike Bloomberg was running for president recently, spent $1 billion and backed out of the race.
Didn't he vow to spend all of his money to destroy Trump?
I wasn't sure if he said that. I thought I heard him say that. I wasn't sure. But again, it's anecdotal. I thought I heard him say that too, that he was going to put his resources behind it. I didn't think it might manifest itself this way, and I'm not saying it has. Just coincidentally, this red map that had Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos in red when nobody was dead comes from the Mike Bloomberg School of Public Health at Johns Hopkins University. And for those of you who think that's hyperbole,
John. He said he's only going to spend all the money he had left over after the gay ice cream budget was exhausted.
Yeah, but, honestly. And that's what we were asking on the show. All right, so let's go to the next slide, and I'll explain where this goes. We've been asking this peak concept, right, that we see in the COVID-19 outbreak. Now go to the next slide. Compare it to H1N1 on the next slide. Go one more page. All right, this is influenza. So we got peak and peak, right? How do you explain that? Is this a coincidence? Right, and we've been asking.
Well, a lot of people asked last week, is this a characteristic of influenza? Have you gone back and looked at the previous years? And you did. And it was not.
I did, and I put that in the appendix. It's all the way at the end of the presentation. So when we wrap up the show, we'll look at that as we're wrapping up. But yes, I went back and looked at all the other years to see, did we have any of these double humps before? And the answer is no, we didn't. This is a strange behavior. So this is a strange behavior. And I have the charts, and we'll show those to you. And I don't want to go too sidetracked on this, but the point is, this has been on your mind, it's been on my mind. The audience is wondering what the hell's going on here. All right, so then the question becomes, might this be some sort of a thumbprint of a given virus? In other words, hypothetically speaking, we asked on the show, are we seeing the behavior of two viruses or not? Is this the behavior of a particular virus? I don't know the answer, but I'm going to pose the question hypothetically. I just put that out on the table. I don't know, right? So let's go to the next slide. Radar show on Friday. I was watching a TED Talk from Thessalonica, Greece, from 2016. So I'm watching a 4-year-old TED Talk from Thessalonica, Greece, on epidemiology. This is how I spend my weekends. Okay? And the talk is about depletion of susceptibles. And depletion of susceptibles for an outbreak, right, for an epidemic. And an epidemic reaches a certain point all the time called the depletion of susceptibles. And it's when the people who are susceptible to the virus have either succumbed to it and died, or got sick and recovered. And the rest of the people who are not susceptible to it for whatever reason haven't gotten it and aren't going to get it. Right. And that's called depletion of susceptibles.
Medical term, not your term.
Yeah, I don't know if it's a medical or epidemiology. All right, so as I'm studying this, the woman in the TED Talk is putting this chart up on the... I get goosebumps. She's showing the Spanish flu from 1918. And this is just part of her talk, talking about depletion of susceptibles, right? So I'm watching the depletion of susceptibles presentation, right, to document that I believe that's where we are in this outbreak, right? I think we have achieved depletion of susceptibles with the second peak, right? And she puts this slide up from 1918 that's written with a feather by candlelight. Thank you, Joe Rogan, for that one. That's one of your best lines, Joe. Written by feather by candlelight, right? This is from 1918, and this is in her presentation. And I about fell out of my chair. This is the Spanish flu outbreak that killed 50 million people in 1918, 1919. And what do we see? Okay, New York, London, Paris, Berlin. Let's go to the next slide. What jumps out at me?
The double hump.
Double hump. Back in 1918, somebody on a piece of parchment made a graph of the deaths. On a piece of parchment, made a graph. We look and we see the double hump. All right, so now we've got to give a tip of the hat to Old Man Cullen. Old Man Cullen sees this, and I sent this to him, and he says to me, how much time is there between those two peaks? And I said, oh man, that's a good question. So we measure the time between 100 days, just about 100 days, give or take. Right? So I would say plus or minus 10 days, it's 100 days. Right? So it could be 90, it could be 96, it could be 104. All right. Boom. And I lay coronavirus on top, and the peak in April, they're almost identical, 100 years later. All right. So I see this, and I'm falling out of my chair. This is amazing. So I get all excited, right? So then I go back to dig into the coronavirus mortality data that we've been using every week. Same stuff every week, right? So I go into the site.
Oh, wait a second, let me pause you for basically brought it back.
So it says that since 1995, they've been piecing together the DNA of Spanish flu.
Why would they do that?
Because they didn't watch Jurassic Park or they didn't read the book, right? The whole point of Michael Crichton's Jurassic Park is just because you can doesn't mean you should. Just because we have the technology to recreate Tyrannosaurus Rex doesn't mean that the Bronx Zoo should start doing that. But seriously, the number is between 30 and 50 million people died in 1918, 1919. And as you research the Spanish flu, now more and more people are saying that that is really what ended World War I. It wasn't the combat, it was the Spanish flu, and it wiped everybody out. And Spain was not engaged in the war, so Spain was talking about the flu, and everybody thought it was them because nobody else was talking about it. All right, let's talk about dying with coronavirus versus dying from coronavirus. I'm digging into the data I'm going to get our coronavirus data. All right, this is where my background, it's going to sound strange again, but this is where my background in magic comes back to play. They've been hiding this in plain sight. And there's a trick that you can find on the internet. I think it's called greatcardtrick.com or onlinecardtrick.com. All right, on the page that we have been downloading the data, the CDC has been showing us a and that number allows me to do something called derived values. And we're going to use some derived values to do something that you're not going to see at the Washington Post. You're not going to see on CBS, NBC, ABC, CNN. You're not going to see it. All right, so this is exclusive. All right, what was the CDC showing us the whole time? Right in front of our face, but it's not in the button, is in red. The number in green is the number they're reporting. So the number on the left side of the screen, 167, is all deaths involving COVID. Now the number on the Johns Hopkins map is bigger than that. Okay, Johns Hopkins is, they are factoring in some other stuff, but these numbers here, these are deaths. This is death certificate stuff, okay? So 167,158 is the number the CDC is reporting. Okay, you're on the CDC website, right?
Which link was it?
Up on top. Oh yeah, oh that's right, you're in my deck, but yes, this is on the CDC website, and this is August 28th, so this is Friday. Or updated Friday.
I think I've got it here, updated September 1st. This is it, right?
Okay. Yeah. Okay, now look at the column over to the right that I highlighted. All right, go circle it.
All right. Yep.
And read what that says, and take a minute to take in the thing in red. So read what that column is.
Excluding influenza. So they're basically saying right here in the United States that of 167,558 total deaths that involved COVID-19, and this speaks directly to that 6% thing and the presentation I saw from the medical doctor this morning, that it doesn't mean that 6% of this total was the actual number. The revelation that you're bringing to us is that the deaths involving COVID-19, out of these 167,558, the ones that don't include influenza are 74,236, some 93,000 deaths that are basically attributed to influenza.
All right, so let's read this column heading again with the audience, because the cognitive dissonance here is going to be upsetting. All right, so this is a major breakthrough. This is a cleave in the number. We are about to cut the number down the center, in fact, almost, right? So this is a cleave. And what that means is the cognitive dissonance is going to be high, meaning it's almost nauseating to look at them. Deaths involving coronavirus, but there's no influenza, is 74,000. Now, you did that in your head, but can you explain to the audience how did you come up with that number? You came up with that number by taking the total number of deaths that involve COVID, and then you subtracted the number of people that don't have influenza, and now you're going to come up with the number of people and also had influenza. Now, that's called a derived value, and that's a number that's not in the table. It's not being, but that is deductive reasoning. So that's a number that you can say with 100% certainty. So this is deductive reasoning versus inductive, and we've talked about that here as well. So deductive reasoning is I can say with certainty 167,558 people have died according to the CDC. According to the CDC, 74,236 of those people did not have influenza. Well, that means the number works out to be
322
people who have been reported by Johns Hopkins as having died of coronavirus also have influenza, according to the CDC. Oh, they're not giving you that column that says deaths involving, they're not providing that number, but you just did the math, right?
Yeah.
Have died, had both coronavirus and H1N1 and pneumonia, because it's pneumonia that's going to kill them, right? The pneumonia goes into the cytokine storm and they drown, basically. So, what do you guys think? Do these 93,000 deaths, the fact that the Johns Hopkins showed you
influenza, which is clearly a larger problem, I think that the true story would be, hey, there's an influenza outbreak that's being aggravated by a novel virus that when the two are combined, the patient seems extremely susceptible to death.
When the two are combined, you get 93,000 dead. Right. When the two are combined, you get 93,000 93,000 dead, which is more than any influenza season that we've had in recent memory, according to the CDC. Not according to what we see, but according to CDC's reports, alone would be any influenza season we've ever had. Right, so like you said, coronavirus plus influenza, 93,000 people. Right, so now, what if we made, what if we then said, well, let's separate these populations a little bit. Let's take the 74,000 people with coronavirus that did not have influenza, and let's look at just the influenza P&I reporting right now. How many people have influenza or have died? Right, in the United States comes from the CDC's P&I mortality database. So I'm comparing two different things here. So this is comparing two different diseases. I'm comparing the influenza outbreak with a portion Mel-Q did, and in here they're breaking down all the age groups and races and all this stuff. But halfway down the page, it explains the comorbidity, and you'll see the word comorbidity about halfway down the page. And just keep going. Right. So when you get to comorbidity, it says Table 3 shows the type of health conditions and contributing causes mentioned in conjunction with deaths involving coronavirus disease. And this is the part that the mainstream media lost their mind over. For 6% of the deaths, COVID-19 was mentioned. Okay, so for 6% of the deaths, COVID-19 is the only cause mentioned. For deaths with conditions or causes in addition to COVID-19, on average, there were 2.6 additional conditions or causes per death. The number of deaths with each condition or cause is shown for all deaths and by age groups for data on comorbidities. Okay, so I think that's just kind of factual. I don't think there's anything to derive out of that other than there's a certain percentage of the coronavirus deaths that coronavirus is the only thing it says, and then there's an average of 2.6 comorbidities on the remaining population. Is that your interpretation?
Yeah.
Okay, so now we know that of that comorbidity population, 93,000 people had a comorbidity that included influenza during an H1N1 outbreak. Okay, safe to say, right? That's one of the 2.6. Okay, right. In 93,000 of them, right? And then other people, right? We know that people who have diabetes, people who have COPD,
right, respiratory problems,
emphysema. Yeah, if you've got emphysema,
right, respiratory problems.
If you frequently have had pneumonia, if you're some sort of immunocompromised, that's the other group, right? But the pure nothing but COVID, according to the CDC, is 6%, right? So according to them, it's 6%. But this number that we have that shows 74,000 people that don't have influenza drives that derived value. So again, this has been hiding in plain sight, except when you hit the download button. And when you hit the download button, that column of numbers and that title aren't in the data. They don't send that to you. So every week when I'm downloading it, that's not there. And that's what I mean. It's like a magic trick. They put it on the screen. You might not notice it. I don't even bother looking at the screens because I get the downloads each week, right? So I just hit the update. I don't bother. And then I look at the screen and I see this and I'm like, oh my God, this is huge. They just cleaved the number for us. No, 93,000 of the 167,000 people also had influenza, and most likely H1N1, because the symptoms that they've described these people dying from,
well, they're not consistent. I mean, coronavirus symptoms,
Here's that paragraph that the president cited in his tweet that Mel-Q tweeted, and again, I'm not going to interpret it. I'm just going to highlight it, and you guys read it. And of the deaths, COVID-19 was the only cause mentioned. This is CDC. For deaths with conditions or causes in addition to COVID-19, on average, there were 2.6 additional conditions or causes per death. What you're not going to see on CBS, what you're not going to see on 60 Minutes, what you're not going to see on CNN is break it down. Show us the numbers. That's what you don't see on the mainstream media.
It has exactly the same peak. So something, and it might just, my friends have said, look, 1,000 is not a big number, there's 45,000 deaths in Israel every year, natural death, don't get excited about this. But it still is interesting that...
What does that make you think?
Something else happened that year. Maybe it was a different thing. Maybe that same thing has happened this year.
You mean it could have been a different virus? Or
it could have been the same virus, we don't know. I think that, again, I keep on coming back to the fact that of all the viral diseases we've ever had, only one disease has been tested as much as this. We have done millions of tests for the RNA in the virus. If we would have done exactly the same thing in 2017, the number of flu deaths would be much, much higher than the current number of COVID deaths, because flu is so widespread. And remember, the virus is, it's like saying, do you die with water on you? I mean, viruses are they're small things. So I think that this is a very important issue going forward. I think that in some ways, we've used a test. In other words, normally diseases are looked at by symptoms. Are you coughing in a certain way? Do you have a fever? Have you lost your sense of smell? Those are all fine. But if you simply say, is the virus on you?
So this goes to the whole question of how it can ever end. I mean, your predictions will be predictions, but much more importantly for the world, what happens to society and where we decide to change our approach will be predicated on these kinds of numbers. So, is it your view then that the virus is going to be around for a long time, maybe even forever. We will have fluctuating degrees of numbers of cases. Will those curves that we've put on the board ever go to zero?
So I think at some point we need to either make curves like that for influenza, and when people say, oh, I didn't realize influenza was so terrible, and I didn't get upset about it, therefore why am I getting upset about something which is as lethal a disease, but is even occurring more or less? So again, having a comparison. Panic comes from when you don't know what to expect. And in COVID, because of the method of testing, we had no idea what to expect. I think that at some point, we're going to get tired of testing. It's a huge waste of money. This money could much better go to helping people who've lost their jobs, homeless people on the streets of London are very full these days. And it's great for the pharmaceutical companies selling test kits, but it's not doing anything because you could find influenza. For example, how many people died of COVID and influenza? And why did we quite say they died from COVID, not from influenza? It's not a meaningful thing. Excess death is meaningful. And it's not just the number of excess deaths, it's the age range. If there had been 180,000 excess deaths in Europe, and they'd all been under 50, this would be a major disaster. And again, I'm not in any way trying to say that the death of an 85-year-old is different from the death of a 5-year-old. One has had their life, one wants to have their life, but there is an asymmetry there. It's a very, in this age of PC, in the past you would have simply said, years of life lost, in this case it's 0, in this case it's 85, add them up. And medical systems do that, but nowadays, for PC, you don't say that. So it's the age range of the deaths and their number. They are comparable in number to flu, and in COVID, it's important to remember this, and to remember 50% are over 85, and less than 10% are under 65. And almost all have comorbidities. I don't know about comorbidities with influenza, but the age ranges are exactly the same.
I mean, that the argument doesn't have political purchase for obvious reasons, but everyone, a lot of people are within those vulnerable groups, and even people who aren't have parents and grandparents. I don't think it's going to win the argument to say, well, they're old, so we should think about it differently.
I accept that, except that if I went to the health service in the United States anyway saying, look, I want a new heart, I'm important, give me a new heart. They'd say, well, look, we give new hearts to people who are young, so they can use it for a long time. Equally well, the National Health System has a very precise number of how much is worth investing in an old person's health. So this is just double speak. I mean, it's politically inappropriate, but it gets to the other side of the scale about the value of an unborn child, the value of a sperm. You can make these arguments, for example, when you turn off ventilated child, the value of a sperm. You can make these arguments, for example, when you turn off ventilators for people who've been ill, Terri Schiavo. These are all very difficult moral arguments. But ultimately, for me personally, the value, my life, is much less valuable than the life of my grandchildren.
Considering the future, let's take the next year, there are really two big picture scenarios, aren't there? Either Michael Levitt is broadly right, regardless of the details of these predictions, and that the big peak has already happened. From now on, we're going to be into these kind of philosophical arguments about what constitutes a real death and whether we should be worried about case numbers if they're asymptomatic, but lots and lots of people aren't going to be dying. Or the more pessimistic view is right, which is there is even worse to come. There's going to be a big second wave. Countries that have not had it badly will now get it badly, and that the proof will be in the pudding in coming months that actually the more pessimistic people were right all along. Do you see it in that two-part?
Firstly, the future is unknowable, but it's important to realize that a virus is a very simple object. Society is a very complicated object. I worked out that the amount of information in COVID would be 40 tweets worth of information, and flu would be about a third of that. So these viruses don't have a lot inside them. They behave in very simple ways. And this coronaviruses have been around. One of my friends who's a virologist, I got into this at the end of January, he's a virologist, he said, don't worry, coronaviruses, we have many of them, common colds are coronaviruses, and they have a tendency to become less lethal. So I don't know, that could be wrong, but I think if you combine that with the upcoming news that I'm sure you're very well aware of that the herd immunity may be occurring at 20%, not at 80%, because of T-cell immunity, we basically have learned to live with coronavirus itself, that is making any coronavirus and killing it, rather than waiting for the virus to express itself on the surface of the cell and create antibodies. So if these things are true, and it seems that these things were questions in February, but have all become true. I just got an email saying that Manaus in Brazil was a disaster situation, reached 20% and stopped. That's important this year. It's in its winter season. So if we take that as a data point, I still feel very confident. But aware that I could be wrong. I mean, I'm not the Oracle of Delphi. That this is not going to flare up in the winter. Now, again, when you talk about places that have been, pockets that have not been hit, typically the number that seems to be the magic number is about 500 deaths per million population. Again, no one wanted any deaths, but nobody did particularly well protecting any one age group, so those 500 deaths would be, half would be over 85 and so on. Seems to be a number where things saturate. And we've seen nothing. There have been centers like Bergamo in New York that got to much higher levels, and I'm sure if we were to take the population and inject them all with coronavirus, we could get to much higher levels, but immunity depends on the typical level of contact. If this had been a flu virus, I'd be much more worried. Flu is a much more devious virus than corona. We don't have any common colds that are flu viruses. Flus cannot be easily tamed. They're much too mutatable. Coronavirus viruses, by their nature, are kind of staid. They have a relatively large genome. Their genome is 3 times larger than flu. It's a single piece. Flu's genome is 7 little pieces. 7 little pieces. So it can swap pieces with other flus. I mean, it's really designed to keep us on our toes and cause massive excess deaths year after year after year. So I think that coronavirus, there will not be a winter wave of any substance. I hope it will also not occur in those countries that have been relatively spared, countries like Norway, Denmark, Austria, Israel. I think they will actually catching up. I think there's a lot of catching up going on. Israel now is definitely trying to get as many cases as it can in order to reach some level of saturation. And the saturation number need not be 500 per million. It might be as little as 100 per million. It depends on what fraction of the population have the right T cells. That may even come from the fact that it's a country where there are lots of children. Because most people know that when your grandchildren are in nursery school, you get sick all the time if you're with them. So you're getting common colds all the time. This could be a protection for Asia, where many, many times the children are brought up by the grand. These things could reduce that number from, say, 20% for herd immunity down to 10%. It's a variable number. Again, it also depends on the strength of contact. If you take a sick person and a healthy person and lock them up together in a small room for a long period of time, there's a much higher chance.
Advocate, if we give you the power, and Michael Levitt can now decide public policy across Europe and America, what is it? I mean, are you saying, okay, everybody, masks off, out in the street, behave normally?
What I would say is, get out and about. Don't do what's comfortable. Wearing a mask makes you feel better. That's fine. It's washing your hands all the time. But try as hard as you can to get back to normality. Lack of normality is a terrible, terrible risk. Society, we've torn the fabric of society, and all those things are torn. This is a massive risk. I don't know how to evaluate it, but I would not be surprised if the risk of tearing up society had 10 times higher excess deaths with than COVID. People die from poverty. People die from desperation. People die from alcoholism. I think we looked at the statistics and said, how much is alcohol use up? We could easily get a month of excess death. To give you some examples, lots of tobacco smoking, a strong smoker loses 10 years of life. Not 120 times higher risk for a permanent smoker. An alcoholic might lose 4 or 5 years of life from this compared to corona. So a month of excess death is huge. But every single day in the world, 150,000 people die. 150,000 people die. So essentially, the world complete toll of corona, which is about 700,000, is 5 days of normal natural death in the world. This is a long way from 30 days. And again, I think it should be your choice. You know, a lot of grandparents have said, look, for me, a month is actually much more important because then you... So for me, a month is 1% of that time. If I was 30 and I was going to lose a month. So I don't think it makes a lot of sense. I'm not sure that I would go to a huge gathering, especially, let's say we were going to have singing with lots of breathing. I'm not sure that I would travel on a very crowded underground. But these are my personal risks. I honestly think that the level of danger, and obviously if you're a very sick 90-year-old, then you might want to be more, but again, it's also only a month for you. It's just that for a sick 90-year-old, you don't have too many months left. So, that's really the question. How many months do you have left? And it's also a question of how much is it worth me seeing my grandchildren or seeing my mother versus living an extra month. It's not, living an extra month doesn't seem to me to be so valuable. Now, if somebody said, well, it's this month, so be it. We don't know. You're not going to be hit by a bus walking out of the studio today.
Let's just say that you are right in a broad brush, and that
Yeah, we were thinking about this. So on the one hand, it's probably wrong of me to say that lockdown was a mistake. Even if it was, because if people have done it, they should be told that it was probably a good idea when we did it, but it's no longer necessary. There's nothing to be frightened of. And it's not, I think the whole battle with the epidemiologists said we have to lock down the damage it caused. That damage we will suffer. There's no point in dwelling on that. But I think going forward, we need to basically do whatever we can to get back to normal.
Australians talking about what is happening in Australia.
That are speaking out, Renee, on the Gold Coast, Vanos, in the police state of Victoria. So I'll let you guys share with us what's really going on there.
Hi, Renee, Vanos, good to meet you guys. Thank you, Imani. So let's jump in. Lockdown, curfew, closed, all police checkpoints, work permits, drone surveillance, chopper patrols, 23-hour confinement, 1-hour exercise, mandatory medical procedures, banned travel, food rationing, closed churches, denied sunshine, school closures, masks allocated, shopping times, government adds to homes without a warrant, no wedding celebrations, no gatherings, decimated economy, limited attendees at funerals, business closures, no family visits, movement banned beyond 5-kilometer range, military patrols, government removal of children, indefinite restrictions, censorship, social media, mass suicides, bankruptcies, 1 million unemployed, massive increase in domestic violence, and more. I'm going to use blunt language. What the fuck is going on in Australia? That is called treason, people. Treason. Look the word up. Treason. It is punishable by death. It always has been. This is the time, friends, Antipodeans. This is the time. There is not going to be another time unless we shake this down. Desire to express the fire of rage that's in our bellies at what is going on to our brothers and sisters. You guys live in Australia. It's happening to you. You are the sacrificial harvest. Speak to us. Fun. Harvest, speak to us. Thanos, please begin.
Well, Sasha, the way you rounded that up, it doesn't feel as bad as it was until you expressed the whole shopping list of how bad it really is. It feels like we're in a movie. It doesn't even feel real. I wake up every day and I still can't believe that, though I'm meeting all of these amazing people online and really connecting with people, I can't believe that we are living in a country where our rights have been stripped away to the point that we're almost like we're on house arrest as criminals. Or Health Minister in our state, in Victoria, said that they were using numbers from palliative care as COVID death statistics. And I thought, on what planet is that moral and ethical whatsoever?
Well, right there, that is called fraud. And right there, that is institutional fraud, meaning to say it's being sanctioned and promulgated by the government. The government is committing the fraud against the people. Now, anyone else, and with an IQ above 12, above the IQ of an apricot, knows full well that this is all orchestration. But that right there is fraud. So why is it that people who are losing their elderly, infirm, and aged parents in nursing homes are unable to embrace them as they depart this world? After 75, 85 years. What is it in the Australian blood that is lacking right now? Why are people not able to become enraged by this travesty that is taking place? Just that piece about keeping elderly and infirm people away from the embrace of their families. Just that piece of goddamn insanity. What is it in the Australians? I've been looking at this, I've been speaking to people, social ecologists, people that are trying to understand what is it. And the general feedback I'm getting is, well, the Australians, like the Canadians, have had it too good for far too long. It's kind of like a cultural comfort zone that has become actual dissonance, where you don't rock the boat because rocking the boat isn't even built into the zeitgeist as a possibility. It's always going to be blue skies in Australia. It's always going to be sun and surf. It's always going to be enough food and plenty for the people. So do you guys think, and I'm going to put this to Renee, as well as invite your opening comments, but do you think it's that kind of cultural comfort zone that has moved into a default right now?
But not only that, I'm looking at vegan leaders who are spiritual life coaches that are actually abusing people, calling them selfish and arrogant conspiracy theories for even questioning the narrative from the government. Every single day I am in shock with what's happening in Australia, and there are people applauding Dan Andrews, our Premier in Victoria, saying he's doing an amazing job, he must be exhausted, and thank you for everything you're doing. They're essentially saying thank you for locking us up, thank you for taking away our freedoms, and do whatever the hell you like because we're going to obey. And do whatever the hell you like because we're going to obey. It's insanity.
What I read out was a whole lot worse than was introduced in Nazi Germany in the first couple of years of the war. A lot worse. This is so sophisticated. This is spooky. This is creepy. Not as creepy as the liberal intellectuals that you just described to me. Because that lot of toxic element of society right now. Because that liberal intellectual class is what props up the evil. It props up the wickedness of the bureaucracy and the technocracy. Don't ask me why. I've not yet divined what the reason is. But I found the same thing in Manhattan and in Hollywood, in America. On the flanking middle America for me is the pulse of the good. I'd say Christian because it's essentially Christian, but the pulse of middle America is the most beautiful, grounded, patriotic, this beautiful soul. And then on the east and west coast, you've got this liberal intellectual class that are utterly perverse intellectually. They think that turning little boys into little girls, Indianism, all of this stuff is acceptable. They think that good thing. They are utterly perverse. They think that social engineering, Fabianism, all of this stuff is acceptable. They think that putting 40,000 satellites in the sky, Elon Musk, great going there, guy, Mr. Proxy for the Rockefellers and Rothschilds, they think that kind of thing is achievement. They've got no sentience or organic spark left, the people that you just described to me. So look at leadership in Australia as being what it is. I'm going to use the word satanic in the truest context of the word. Go and study satanic action. Saturnian, satanic, Luciferian, false light, the idolatry, false light worship. That's all the language that we're seeing here in the echelon that is leading Australia to the bowels of hell right now. And people, there's things going on underground on the deep underground basis. There's other storylines happening in Australia that are connected to how that country has been incredibly weaponized by the Vatican and Anglo-American complex. I'm talking the Rouge factions within the CIA in the same way that Canada was being set up. Five Eyes, okay, is a transnational compact of intelligence agencies that is connected to 5 countries. Australia is one of them. New Zealand is another. Canada is another. England is another. And America is another. I'm talking to the audience here. Why do you think it is that those 5 nations are the most right now that are in the grip or the thrall of this new world order, or this attempt to roll out the new world order? Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, United Kingdom, and America. America is being somewhat retrieved by the Trump administration with the cleaning of the swamp and all stuff. And look how the liberal intellectuals are shrieking about that. And their satanic media that they control through the Associated Press, Agence France Presse, Reuters networks. But Australia is very much in the grip of that culture. And I think that's the piece that people in Australia are going to have to wake up to. But it's going to take folks like you, Thanos and Renee. God knows how you do it, don't know.
Fast. In imagery of what Fromm's going to talk about. So Fromm's basic argument is that fascism has resulted from a kind of universal, a generalized escape from freedom, right? That there are people who have a social character that isn't capable of bearing the burdens of freedom, there's a fear of freedom, and hence an escape from it. And so his argument is that there are three basic ways to escape from freedom. One of them is authoritarianism, sort of depicted here in this little cobweb sketch of mine, where you're in a world of kind of sadomasochism, right? So you are sadistically submitting to power above, while you're sadistically kicking down to those below, while masochistically submitting to those above. So it's a power structure, an authority structure, and where each individual ceases to strive along self-chosen pathways, but instead becomes part of a kind of sadomasochistic structure. That's authoritarianism. So it's the giving up of freedom, the escape from freedom, into something like sadomasochistic strivings into structures of authority. And this is going to be one of his primary framings for explaining the rise of fascism. This planet weaponry, and so he writes about this desire not to insert oneself into a structure of authority where you have sadomasochistic strivings, but he actually calls it necrophilia, right? Cultural necrophilia, where you seek to escape from the struggles of life into the certainties of death, right? Explosion, ultimately submission to the dead. The dead's going to be important. Worshipping the dead, being part of a power structure that is essentially a weapon of death. Militaries, for example, would probably fit here. So having a society that revolves around the dead and generating death and so on, destructiveness. More on that as we go.
For instance, what would you say is happening to man, American man, in relationship to his work?
I think his work is to a large extent meaningless, because he is not related to it. He is increasingly part of a machinery, social machinery, governed by a big bureaucracy, and I think American man unconsciously hates his work very often, because he feels trapped by it, imprisoned by it, because he feels that he's spending most of his energy for something which has no meaning in itself.
By meaning in itself, he uses his work to make a living, so that is dignified, sensible, and necessary.
Yes, but that is not quite enough to make one happy if one spends 8 hours a day in something which in itself has no meaning or interest except that one gains money from it. There is a creative pleasure which, for instance, the artisan in the Middle Ages or in a country like Mexico still today has, namely the pleasure of creating something. Now you find quite a few skilled workers who still have that pleasure. Maybe in a steel mill, maybe a worker who works with a complicated machine. He has a sense that he's creating something. But if you take a salesman who sells a useless commodity, he feels like a fraud and he hates his commodity like something. Well, in the first place, I would say our social relationships are relatively shallow. We are actually afraid to be intimate with people. Many people even with their wives and husbands. And we substitute, or we rather hide this fear of real intimacy by a superficial kind of friendliness, which is quite nice, but nevertheless very shallow. But I think there's another answer to your question, which I should like. If you take the average American, and studies have shown that, he is really concerned only with private affairs. That is to say, with his health, his money, and family affairs. He is not concerned with his society. He talks about it. But if one speaks of being concerned, I mean something about which one loses one's sleep. And the average American never loses his sleep about affairs which relate to his society and to our whole country. That is to say, I mean, he has separated his private life from his existence as a member of his society, and especially for the government to take care of.
Do you think that is happening to American man, and of course we're speaking not only of American man, but American woman as well here, Dr. Fromm, in relationship to his politics, to his political beliefs?
Yes, indeed. We have in the same way relegated our own responsibility in what happens to our country to the specialists who are supposed to take care of it, and the individual citizen does not feel he can judge, and even that he should judge and take any responsibility. I think there are quite a number of recent developments which show that. So here you point out to one really of the basic defects of our system, that the individual citizen has very little possibility of having any influence, of making his felt in the decision-making. And I think that in itself leads to a good deal of political lethargy and stupidity. It is true that one has to think first and then to act. But it's also true that if one has no possibility of acting, one's thinking kind of becomes empty and stupid.
Case. And I think that's important because, in all likelihood, is a good way of putting it. The vast majority of these people have immunity. Instead of saying there is no evidence, the WHO kind of fed into this by saying no evidence of immunity. And in reality, there's every evidence stacking up. In fact, a lot of the different studies have shown that it is very unlikely that you get it again in the short term. With regard to going back to school, one thing that was left out of that discussion is mortality. I mean, shouldn't we at least be discussing what the mortality of children is? This is for Dr. Fauci as well. The mortality between 0 and 18 in the New York data approaches 0. It's not going to be absolutely 0, but it almost approaches 0. Between 18 and 45, the mortality in New York was 10 out of 100,000. So really, we do need to be thinking about that. We need to observe and mind what went on in Sweden where the kids kept going to school. The mortality per capita in Sweden is actually less than France, less than Italy, less than Spain, less than Belgium, less than the Netherlands, about the same as Switzerland. But basically, I don't think there's anybody arguing that what happened in Sweden is an unacceptable result. I think people are intrigued by it, and we should be. I don't think any of us are certain when we do all these modelings. There have been more people wrong with modeling than right.
We're opening up a lot of economies around the U.S., and I hope that people who are predicting doom and gloom and saying, oh, we can't do this, there's going to be a surge, will admit that they were wrong if there isn't a surge, because I think that's what's going to happen. In rural states, we never really reached any sort of pandemic levels in Kentucky and other states. We have less deaths in Kentucky than we have in an average flu season. It's not to say this isn't deadly, but really outside of New England, we've had a relatively benign course for this virus nationwide. And I think the one-size-fits-all, that we're going to have a national strategy and nobody's going to go to school, is kind of ridiculous. We really ought to be doing it school district by school district, and the power needs to be dispersed because people make wrong predictions. And really the history of this, when we look back, will be of wrong prediction after wrong prediction after wrong prediction, starting with Ferguson in England. So I think we ought to have a little bit of humility in our belief that we know what's best for the economy. And as much as I respect you, Dr. Fauci, I don't think you're the end all. I don't think you're the one person that gets to make a decision. We can listen to your advice, but there are people on the other side saying there's
about this pandemic. And it seems that from all the statistics coming in, from information coming from Sweden and others, it seems that this whole lockdown thing is a failed experiment. Because new data suggests that social distancing and reopening haven't determined the spread. 6 months into the COVID-19 pandemic, the U.S. has now carried out two large-scale experiments in public health. First, in March and April, the lockdown of the economy to arrest the spread of the virus. Second, since mid-April, the reopening of the economy. The results are in. Counterintuitive though it may be, statistical analysis shows that lockdown the economy didn't contain the disease spread, and reopening it didn't unleash a second wave of infections. So everything they told us to do, we didn't need to do it. And now we see that the deaths are dropping dramatically. We see cases are moving up, but the tests are faulty because it can show that it's picking up a common cold. It can give you false positives, and we already have a cure. But nobody wants to talk about that. They just keep censoring those individuals that have done actual clinical trials. And it seems that the U.S. is not going to be joining Japan, Germany, the European Union, the WHO on COVAX. This is their coronavirus vaccine initiative. Trump decided we are bowing out. Just like the Paris Climate Accord, just like the World Trade Organization, just like defunding the World Health Organization, we are now bowing out of this. Why? Well, remember, the CDC has reported that only 6% actually died from the China virus. Now remember, 6% actually died from it. 6% actually died from it. The other 94%, yes, they might have had it, but if you died in a motorcycle accident and you had it, COVID didn't cause it. If you had a heart attack while having COVID, it didn't cause it. The heart attack was the cause of death. If you had another disease, or you had cancer, it wasn't COVID, it was cancer that killed you. And this is what the report is saying. But we know that HCQ has been shown to cure people. Why would we need to vaccinate hundreds of millions of people if less than 9,500 died? Why would we need a vaccine if we have a therapeutic that works? The other question we need to ask is, what is the real agenda of COVAX? I think we all know this. I think we know exactly what they're trying to do here. And we've talked about this before. Chip and other things. You have a paper, you don't have a paper, you can't work, you can't do this. It seems that's the direction they're going in. Trump is going in a completely different direction. Now, with this second event, it seems that it is completely falling apart. Since the medical examiner came out with the actual death certificate of what George Floyd died of, which was an overdose, it seems that Derek Chauvin's lawyers are saying that we need to dismiss the charges now because he didn't die from him kneeling on him. He died from an overdose. Now, once again, all these riots and all these protests are based on this. And Paul Sperry just wants to put all this into perspective. Activists demanding a national conversation on alleged systematic racism in policing don't want to talk about the horrifying statistic. A police officer is 18.5 times more likely to be killed by a black male than an unarmed black male is to be killed by a police.
It's important to realize that if society meekly submits to an expert, and that expert is wrong, a great deal of harm may occur when we allow one man's policy or one group of small women to be foisted on an entire nation. Take, for example, government experts who continue to call for schools and daycare to stay closed, or that recommend restrictions that make it impossible for a school to function. For a time, there may not have been enough information about coronavirus in children, but now there is. There are examples from all across the United States and the world that show that young children rarely spread the virus. Centralized power and decision-making based on millions of individualized situations can arrive at what risks and behaviors each individual should choose. That's what America was founded on. Not a herd with a couple of people in Washington all telling us what to do and we like sheep blindly follow. This all begs the question, when are we going to tell the people the truth? That it's okay to take their kids back to school. Dr. Fauci, every day, virtually every day, we seem to hear from you things we can't do. But when you're asked, can we go back to school? I don't hear much certitude at all. I hear, well, maybe it depends. All of this body of evidence about schools around the world shows there's no surge.
All of the evidence shows that it's rare. I mean, we've so politicized this and made it politically correct that the WHO releases that it's rare, and you have a scientist up there honestly giving her opinion. What happens to her? She's blackballed, and her report that she refers to is taken off the website. That scientist's speech, and you try to click on the link. The WHO has now screened it from us because it said something that's not politically corrected. Guess what? It's rare for kids to transmit this. But I hear nothing of that coming from you. All I hear, Dr. Fauci, is we can't do this, we can't do that, we can't play baseball. Well, even that's not based on the science. I mean, flu season peaks in February. We don't know that COVID's going to be like the flu season. It might, but we don't know that. But we wouldn't ban school in October. You might close some schools when they get the flu. We need to not be so presumptuous that we know everything. But my question to you is, can't you give us more on schools that we can get back to school, that there's a great deal of evidence, and it's actually good evidence. The kids aren't transmitting this. It's rare, and the kids are staying healthy, and that, yes, we can open our schools. These graphs behind me show no surge when schools open. The red line is where the schools open. There is data from Austria, Belgium, Denmark, France, Germany, Netherlands. No spike when schools are open. Contact tracing studies in China, Iceland, Britain, and the Netherlands failed to find a single case of child-to-adult infection. Here at home, child care for essential workers continued to be available in some states throughout the pandemic. Brown University researchers collected data on daycares that remained open during the pandemic. Over 25,000 kids in their study found that only 0.16% got COVID, and when you looked at the confirmed cases for staff, there was about 1% of more than 9,000 staff. The YMCA also has put forward statistics. 40,000 kids at 1,100 sites. There were no virus outbreaks or clusters. Dr. Joshua Sharfstein of Johns Hopkins writes, there is converging evidence that the coronavirus doesn't transmit among children like the flu, that it is a lower risk. Just yesterday, the American Academy of Pediatrics says, we got to get kids back in school. We want them physically present in school. They even cite mounting evidence that children are less likely to contract the virus. Ultimately, this all comes down to the fatal conceit that central planners have enough knowledge somehow to tell a nation of 330 million people what they can and can't do. Perhaps our planners might think twice before they weigh in on every subject. Perhaps our government experts might hold their tongue before expressing the opinion whether we can play NFL football or Major League Baseball. Not in October. Perhaps our experts might think twice before telling the whole world that a COVID vaccine likely won't provide herd immunity. We don't know. Why weigh in with these opinions that we have no knowledge of? These are forecasts that may well be wrong. Perhaps our experts might consider the undue fear they are instilling in teachers who are now afraid to go back to work. No one knows the answers to these questions. We shouldn't presume that a group of experts somehow knows what's best for everyone.
In George Orwell's classic dystopian novel 1984, protagonist Winston wonders whether he is the only person who retains a real memory and doubts the narrative of the party. He has no way to find out whether everyone else truly believes the government revised version of history or simply acts like they do. Such matters is verboten, punishable by vaporization, deletion from history. Fortunately, we are not quite at that point in the United States. No one has yet been vaporized. Not entirely sure that's true. We seem to be imprisoned by the force of social disapproval, just as surely as Winston was imprisoned by the threat of instant death. Millions of lockdown opponents won't make their position known. Even to their closest family and friends, taking a position publicly is unthinkable. They would lose social standing, clients, and possibly even their jobs. The pro-lockdown crowd enjoys the appearance of majority consensus, and everyone gets more lockdown. I have said many times before in videos, we socially engineer our own selves. We socially engineer each other, and we've got to stop that. The social engineering is not just coming from, the powers that be, the top, controlling all of us. We control all of us. Disapprove of what I say? Oh, then you hate me for it. Or you've got to lash out at me. Or believe as you. I have to believe as you believe. Otherwise, well, that's a lot of comments. I have to do this, I have to do that, I have to speak a certain way, I have to tone it down. More doom and gloom from Negative Carol. How people have put a mask on throughout their entire life. When they go out. And about, how are you? Oh, I'm fine. How are you? Oh, I'm fine. And pretend to the world, I have it all together. I'm fine. I can't show any emotion other than I'm fine and I'm in control. See, I'm never angry. I'm always pleasant. I'm always nice. And I am as inauthentic as I could possibly be. Why do I behave that way? Because, well, if I am real and really speak my mind and share my opinions that go against my social network, I will be abandoned. People won't like me. So I behave inauthentically to get the approval. What a life. What a life. What a life. But that's how most people live it.